So welcome everyone to another episode of Accounting for All Cars, and you join me today in Tess, my 1967 Triumph Vitesse 2 litre. It is a very hot afternoon here, and we've decided to explore an area of Suffolk that I haven't been to with YouTube before, which is a little corner sort of sandwich really between Hadley, Sudbury and Colchester in Essex, and a group of villages around Polstead and Wormingford. So it sort of I suppose straddles the A134. We are just about here outside Hadley, and the plan is to just follow the main road down to Boxford and then drop down going south along the A134 and then go cross country. It's not an area that I know very well, but it is an area of interest, and I'll explain as we proceed on this great adventure. Anyway, we'll get the car fired up and you'll join me shortly. We're just coming into Hadley now. This is a wonderfully medieval town, as you can see, with the timber frame jetty buildings. And the perfect classic truck. Not one I'd associate with Suffolk, the big old Chevrolet, but nonetheless. Now this is Hadley High Street, and very pretty market town. Oh, it's certainly worth a visit here. Wonderful twisted colour wash elevations, all hung on the sort of oak frames. Unmistakably Suffolk. Road we're on here, the 1071, which runs between Hadley and Sudbury, is a great driving road. In recent years they have had to put double white lines down the middle of it to stop over exuberant driving, but it's still rather fun. I see, it's a a double right-hander, hence the 40 mile an hour recommended speed limit. Let's come down into third for this one. Right on the brakes. Just let that open up a bit. Got to be a little more careful in Tess because she has the early rear suspension, so lifting off in the middle of a corner in this car is not to be recommended. And it's a road that I literally don't know, so I have to read this carefully. The reason we've come here is not to pursue Gainsborough or Constable. For that matter, I've done a video a couple of years ago, if you want to have a look, exploring the Dedham Vale, which is where John Constable painted a lot of his most famous works, like the Hayway. But I come really to sort of follow in the footsteps of one of England's greatest writers and commentators of East Anglian social history, and that writer is a chap called Ronald Blythe, or Ronnie Blythe as he preferred to be known. And Ronnie Blythe wrote this wonderful book called Aikenfield at the end of the 1960s, which was partly based on his own family history, and it reflected the kind of poverty that existed in counties like Suffolk, especially from the turn of the 20th century right up until just after the Second World War. And Aikenfield really brought home to the wider public the kind of tyranny that existed in Suffolk villages, particularly from the time of the Enclosure Acts of the early 19th century, when farm labourers and their families lived frankly at the mercy of the landowning class, and what Ron Blythe was describing was a kind of 20th century serfdom. It was clearly not slavery, but it was almost a sort of indentured form of labour, where a wrong word or a misdeed could see an entire family be thrown out onto the streets and made destitute, with their only recourse being to the universally feared institution of the workhouse. Ronnie Blythe grew up, I think he was one of 5 siblings. Perhaps it might not have been, might not be quite right, but certainly I think there was certainly 4 children. His father had been a farm labourer and latterly a gravedigger, and Ronnie had sort of no expectations as a child of doing anything probably other than following his father into the land and labouring for one of the local farms. But somehow his innate sense of curiosity and the generosity of people around him introduced him to the world of reading and books, and he completely transformed himself. Others may disagree with this, but from reading his biography, it feels like he invented himself. He lost his native Suffolk accent, or rather than lost it, disguised it, and he managed to get himself a job as a librarian locally, and then to find like-minded artists and writers in the form of people like John and Christine Nash, who lived in Wormingford, this village that we're coming to now. And it is an extraordinary story of one man's semi-detachment, I think I'd have to describe it, of being able to integrate with other people from very social backgrounds to form deep, meaningful friendships, and yet have the detachment that is necessary to be able to write about those people, their relationships, and indeed their work. And at the same time, to be able to create a narrative around not only his own family history, but the family histories of so many other Suffolk people. And when I think about Ronald Blythe, I think of him as a man who gave a voice to thousands of voiceless men and women and children, particularly those who suffered during the 1930s depression, when agriculture in this part of the world was on its knees and farms were failing and being broken up, and a whole way of life was being sort of thrown to the wolves in a way, as desperate people left the land for the turmoil, I would say, but safety of the manufacturing cities. And this is the kind of landscape they left behind. I'm going to switch the camera around so you can get a slightly better view of where we are. Driving down these lanes around Wormingford, which was the home to Ronald Blythe until he died in his 100th year in 2023, it reminds me how much and yet how little the landscape has changed. You know, we're looking at these pastures off to my left with the red pole cattle, which would have been familiar to Ronald Blythe as a child, and a century and more before him to the artists John Constable and Thomas Gainsborough. What's interesting for me is that this truly beautiful part of the Suffolk countryside is virtually unknown. In a way, the work of Ronald Blythe has become less familiar, although publishing of his recent biography, and I'll give you the details at the end of this short film. I think the publishing of his biography will certainly provoke and stir interest from hopefully a new generation of readers. But whilst the landscape is the same, the social world that he wrote about had largely vanished by the 1960s when he was writing and when the car that we're driving was new. But it has gone completely now. And even for someone of my generation, it has to be said that I don't recognise the social landscape of Suffolk when I compare it to what I knew in the early 1980s when I came to work and to live here as an adult. But I guess that's true of just about everywhere else, and my problem is that when I think about the year 1980, and you can tell me in the comments if this resonates with you, I think that 1980 is 20 years ago. It's incongruent to think that it's 45 years ago. It is almost half a century away. And for me, that's extraordinary. I'm just going to turn the camera around so you can get a sense of the sort of landscape that we've got here. It is quite extraordinary. Sort of gentle vale. We're early June, and the corn, the wheat and barley is still green. We've got another 8 weeks to go before it starts to sort of turn brown, and we get the sort of the bustle of harvest, which of course has happened since Saxon times. But Ronald Blythe, unlike me, was not a petrol head. He used public transport and cycled unbelievable miles through sort of East Anglia. And we think nothing of sort of cycling from here to Albury up on the East Coast to visit sort of friends and to explore Suffolk churches. And the history of churches was a particular fascination for him. And although I think arguably he's someone who might have been ordained, he never did fully immerse himself in the Anglican Church. But what he did do was become a lay reader, and I think I'm right in saying an honorary canon at St Edmundsbury Cathedral, and religion was a very important part of his life, as it was for so many people in these rural areas during the 20th century. You'll have heard me, possibly in some of my earlier videos, talking about one of Suffolk's other writers, George Ewart Evans. Give you a sense of the vale that we've just sort of come up here. As I was saying, George Ewart Evans was a Welshman, as you can probably tell from his name, and he married a local girl, moved to Blackpool where she was the local teacher, and George interviewed lots of old farm workers in the sort of Sandlings area of Suffolk. I'm just going to turn the camera back round it because this is actually a very pretty part of the look at. I'll have to say I've just spotted a very nice Alfa Romeo Spider, but the point I was going to make, is that George Ewart Evans got his material as an outsider by interviewing people, and he had that sort of wonderful outsider's eye, the sort of detached observer. What I think was different for Ronald Blythe was that Blythe lived the lives that he described, and his family evidenced that lifestyle for themselves over the centuries. And so there is a kind of authenticity for me about Ronald Blythe's work, which is remarkable. Now, that is in no way to denigrate George Ewart Evans, whose work I absolutely love, but one of Ronald Blythe's heroes was the 19th century, well, I suppose 18th, 19th century poet John Clare, who also came from a sort of similar but probably more impoverished background, more than 100 years before. And John Clare wrote about the English rural landscape and about nature, and he was writing about the crimes of enclosure which were occurring as the country moved from the 18th to 19th century, and this changed the shape of farming and it changed the shape of rural life, and in effect was one of the factors that almost enslaved the working population by cutting them off from access to their own common land where they could scratch a living, to having to work on these enclosed farms. And the nearest I can get to it today is to sort of equate it to the sort of people's experience of working for companies like Amazon, where you know, the working conditions are so harsh and unforgiving, and the drive is all about money and is very far from person-centred, and certainly not interested in community or heritage in any way. It's a kind of destructive behemoth. And I think that was how John Clare saw the change in farming during the agricultural revolution. And in some ways, the work of Ronald Blythe seems to sort of fit for me with that kind of first-hand narrative of John Clare, whereas one could argue that some of the other romantic poets at the time, like John Keats, was writing in an altogether much more secular way, I suppose. There's a detachment which, while still powerful, feels more similar to George Ewart Evans, that outside observer rather than the man whose DNA came from the soil that he's talking about. I love these little poppies here on the side of a road. And one of the most poignant parts of Aikenfield, the Ronald Blythe book, is the account of the young men escaping what they saw as a kind of slavery and autocracy of the farms and the landowners, to go to war in 1914 as a way to escape the unbearable and really poverty-stricken lives, and then finding that the reality was not what they thought, as in glory for king and country or a great adventure that would be over by Christmas, but simply a vast slaughterhouse from which most never came back. And the Great War, which took out an entire generation of young men of all social classes, is poignant and I'll say that again, is poignantly remembered and memorialised in all the little churches across England, but particularly in places like Suffolk, where so many men were lost in the trenches around places like Ypres, or as they used to call it here, Wipers. And in some of these little village churches, the sons of the landed gentry have their own little corners within the church, memorials, often sort of paid for by heartbroken mothers, whilst the men who cut the hay, who walked the furrows, who took care of the heavy horses, their names are etched into the little stone memorials in the churchyards. But of course their bodies never repatriated. And this is just a glimpse of what they left behind. So I have to say that perhaps as I get older and I become more existential in my outlook, I think, fondly and gratefully to Ronald Blythe and his quiet authority when it came to explaining to the rest of the world what the reality was of living in what we today think of as a Suffolk idyll, but which for so many was simply hell on earth. And in a sense, for some of these young men, they simply swapped one kind of hell for an even more unimaginable hell in places like Flanders. I have to say, I am very impressed with Tess. I've been climbing these little hills, and they are hills, certainly by Suffolk standards, and the temperature gauge is bang in the centre. I've just noticed now as I've eased off the throttle, the electric fan has just cut in, but it's yeah, really good. Right. A bit of bottom gear climbing. Oh, we're into second now. The next village we're headed for is a village called Polstead in Suffolk, and this is one that well, I had this in this lane here. I last came to Polstead as an 11-year-old, literally fresh off the banana boat from Jamaica, and my grandparents took me to my first ever fair in England. I'd never been to a fair before with things like a roundabout and swing boats, and the usual coconut shies or whatever it was, and it was a magical afternoon. I remember a Saturday afternoon much like this in the hot summer of 1976, and I remember my parents and grandparents sort of perching on a bench outside the pub while my sister and I explored with literally wide-eyed wonder this English little travelling fair. And I've always wanted to go back and have a look, and it just happens that we're reasonably close by, so it'd be good to see if I remember any of it. This is the most beautiful afternoon. Oh, good Lord. And there it is, the green and the pub. I'll just bring this round so you can see it. So my memory was there wasn't a fence there, But it's funny, that idea of when I was small, Christmas trees were tall. The village green is a lot smaller than I remember. How extraordinary. Wow. Yeah, it's extraordinary. I'm trying to think how big this fair was. It's obviously much smaller than I must have remembered, but I guess there must have been room for the swing boats and the little roundabout here. And again, it's 11 years old, coming from the West Indies. This was so different. I had no cultural frame of reference, and you know, to see things like thatched cottages for the first time, you know, like the ones we're looking at here, and to have an understanding that houses could be more than 100 years old, when to me, literally, a century was an unimaginable span of time. It was just extraordinary, and yeah, here we are. We have a sort of wonderful farmhouse, and then the barn's next to it. And if I squint, pretend I haven't got the other cars there. It could be 1976 all over again. And my father's Vitesse coming to this little village right on the Essex-Suffolk border. Extraordinary. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this trip out with me in Tess this afternoon. It's been a very personal visit for me, visiting the place of one of my literary heroes, and also just coming back to a part of my childhood that I'd virtually forgotten about. Anyway, join me next time, and I'll see you soon. Take care. Bye.